Well, good morning, everybody. It's another chance for us to gather together and study. Hopefully, you've got your Bibles handy to the text of 1 Corinthians chapter 7 or chapter 9, depending on who you are today. We'll see how this all goes. David, how are you doing?
I'm doing just great, Phil. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Terry, you good?
I'm fantastic. It's good to be with both of you today.
That's good to have everyone else here today. We kind of slowed down in chapter 7 yesterday. We're making a valiant attempt to, I don't know, try to speed up. We'll see how it all goes. But let's go ahead and do a couple of housekeeping matters to begin with. We are trying to finish 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We'll see how that goes. No promises. A reminder, we're looking at the overall Corinthian correspondence that Paul has with the brethren in Corinth, paying attention to its context in the book of Acts, trying to make some good practical understandings of his interaction with a congregation that is full of Christians who are struggling in a number of spiritual dynamics. There are challenges of leadership, there's challenges of morality, there's challenges of connecting themselves deeply to one another in both their relationship as Christians and their relationship to God as being into Christ. And so we've really tried to look at a lot of those various edges and tendrils. Anything else we want to bring up before we slog back into the mire that is chapter 7? David, do you got anything for us to begin with? This is like you're on a sports show, so you got to think of yourself as one of the commentators, watching Muggsy Bogues play or something.
Well, just what comes to mind is that we're in that section of the letter where Paul begins with the words, as I'm reading from the New King James, now concerning, in chapter 7 and verse 1. And then he does that again in verse 25. He'll do it again in verse 1 of chapter 8. And so the appearance is that here their concerns are being addressed, or their questions are being addressed, things that they've written to him about. And so he's responding to particular items that they have raised. And of course, we only have one side of that correspondence. We don't have the questions, we have the answers. And that's what we have to work with here.
Yeah, for sure. Terry, anything else before we get into the reading of the text?
No, I just think probably need to dive back in and try to get through this. I think it's interesting that, what we're really talking about, I think what starts off with is obviously a question about the intimacy in a relationship between a man and a woman, and he really focuses on, now we're in this section of marriage and holiness, and so important section.
Right. Alrighty then. Let's go ahead and read. David, do you want to read for us verses, say, 12 through 16?
12 through 16. But to the rest, I, not the Lord, say, if any brother has a wife who does not believe and she is willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. And a woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. But if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife?
All right, so there's some things we didn't get a chance to really dig into with our study yesterday, particularly the second half of that clause, the redemptive aspects, the sanctification aspects of the marital bond, and how Paul is using that to teach. We talked a little bit about the context of the conflict, whether it is contextually accurate to think of this as a hyper-sexualized culture, and that's the reason for these concerns. How do we incorporate the context of the persecution that's obviously surrounding them? And are there questions and struggles related to how do we survive persecution? Do we stay close to our wives to get separate from them in order that neither of us be harmed spiritually in that area? Is it some combination of those things? I think it's important to pay attention to that when we get to that conclusion context of verses 14 through 16. Because in this micro argument, Paul is trying to help them understand that their perception of those things are perhaps off base, if not fully out in the wrong realm. So as we typically do, we kind of go back to the text and say, David, what are you seeing here in this last portion of, say, verses 14 through 16, or even the entire chunk all the way back to verse 12? That's important for us to understand.
Well, he's addressing here in the context a situation in which you've got a believer married to an unbeliever. So it's a particular, specific kind of marriage relationship, not just a general marriage relationship, but here where you have somebody who has become a Christian who's married to somebody who's not a Christian. And that's where the concerns are in this particular section. How do we view that? How do we handle that? You can imagine among these brethren in Corinth at that time, this is all new to them. One is converted, his mate is not converted. What do we do now? That kind of a situation.
Yeah.
And you think about in the Old Testament and the law of Moses, and the applications of the law of Moses, situations that arose that we read about in Ezra and Nehemiah, and even going back to Deuteronomy chapter 7 about not making marriages with those inhabitants of Canaan. There you had specific instruction dealing with that kind of situation. And now Paul is clarifying the differences between the law of Moses approach to those relationships and the way those relationships are handled in Christ.
Yeah, definitely so. I think there's a lot of that we have to kind of pay attention to. Is there any other New Testament texts? I've got a couple in mind that are important for us to bring into the table, as well as Old Testament pictures in regards to a marriage that is spiritually unequal, in the sense that they're not at the same place of development. I'm thinking of some of Peter's instruction in regards to the marital bond as well, in which the way you influence one another. I think that's part of that to bring in too. Terry?
I think the thing that's most interesting here is in this idea of making your mate holy in this relationship. And I think there's some difficulty to that a little bit, right? I mean, you start thinking about what the implications of that could be. And I think obviously by making holy here is not, I think one of the things to just point out is I don't think Paul's implying an unbeliever suddenly is able to experience salvation simply because they're married to a believer. That's nothing about that here. And so, and it seems to be not so much that it's the necessarily the anything more to me, and maybe you guys can expand upon this more, but that when the non-Christian stands and marries this Christian or is married to this Christian, that the behavior of the one who's a believer and the influence in that relationship tends to have the influence of holiness on the relationship. Seems to be, I think, the first level, as Phil likes to say. There's more deeper than that, I'm sure, but I think there's a part of that that's important to understand is, and I think, I think this passage, by the way, reminds me of 1 Peter chapter 3, where Peter talks about, and I know it's a different context, there's not the distress that we have here. It's very clear in 1 Peter chapter 3 that Peter says to the person who's the believing wife with an unbelieving husband that she has the opportunity to win him over in that way, to influence him in that way. And I just see a lot of connection for me personally between those two concepts here, but look forward to your thoughts on that as well.
So one of the things I think is important for me to pay attention to when I'm thinking through the application of a passage like this is to remember the way in which God shows us how the gospel moves into a person's life. So one of the things that I think is important is to pay attention to the instructive teaching of Jesus in the New Testament, the way he talked about how the message moves forward. He used some very, understandable parable type teaching. Parable of the sower, parable of the mustard seed. Those are things that are important. So we know that the gospel has an impact in that realm. Secondly, we know that influence matters. Aside from specifically telling people that God said this, God said go do this, there is another layer to this where we understand and recognize that how we behave is a representation of Jesus in some sense. And so I think the marital relationship has space there. It's a closest space where your influence probably is stronger than we sometimes want to accept. And so that has space in this text. A third thing is to recognize that even with those two factors, God plays a part in all relationships. He doesn't specify his impacts and his effects, but he's part of that equation too. And I will suggest that in each of these segments, without respect to the process you're thinking is underlying the challenge here, hypersexuality, conflict, etc., a spouse has tremendous drawing power to Jesus. It's the strongest influence that you're going to find on an individual in all things. It's why the longer someone is married, the more they are easily able to be recognized as so-and-so's spouse. And so I would suggest that on that picture to begin with, there's great power there. And the marital relationship itself is one that's built on trust. It is built on one flesh, which Paul just talked about in essence in the introduction section here. And there are consequences to severing the union without respect to the spiritual position of each of the parties. I do not have a perspective that says marriage is a New Testament thing or a Christian thing. Marriage is a biblical thing. It exists in both the covenantal period with the law and exists in Christ, and it supersedes those things. So I think that's part of the factors here too. David?
Well, I
drink. Good timing.
I think that, again, with the backdrop of this idea of an unbeliever married to an unbeliever, the question, and I think he's already addressed this in verses 12 and 13, but also here in verse 14, the question that would come up naturally would be, is this a legitimate union? Is this a real marriage? Is this a legitimate marriage before God here, with a believer married to an unbeliever? Just as far as the marriage relationship itself is concerned, is this something that is legitimate? And I think that question is clearly answered here. It's not an ideal arrangement, for sure. And of course, we can bring other passages in the New Testament into that. But even though it's not an ideal arrangement, it is still a legitimate marriage here. And so he tells them, you don't divorce your mate under those circumstances. And it is a sanctified relationship. The unbelieving mate is sanctified, as Terry pointed out, not in the sense that, oh, I got married to a Christian, now I'm saved, but in the sense that this is a legitimate marriage, and these children who are born to this union are legitimate children. In the fact that it's a believer married to an unbeliever.
Yeah, and I think part of that legitimacy is tied to what Phil talked about earlier, this covenantary aspect of marriage that sometimes we overlook. I mean, it's a covenant with God. Maintaining that covenant brings a sense of holiness to it. And the breaking of that covenant is something that needs to be looked at in some ways, and not in every case, is a sense of unholiness. In a roundabout way. And I think the children part is really interesting in this section because I think that helps us understand the marriage part. The legitimacy of the children helps us understand, almost as an illustration, the legitimacy of the marriage in that idea.
Yeah, I'll add a couple other things I think are important too. I think that in basic terms, and I'll try to use non-technical speak here, God is a participant in lawful marriages. And I say lawful as he has defined law, not as the city's divine law, not as society's defined law, but as his laws come into play. He's a lawful participant in those lawful marriages. With that being the case, Paul is using the accommodative ideas, like he's using these pictures of unclean and clean and holy and unholy to a group that's struggling with questions about holiness involved into marital relations. And so he's kind of using these things to teach us, hey, just remember, your marriage is something that is God's a part of, because it's something he has built. And your children, the offspring of these marriages, he's a part of that too. So if you're going to toss it to the curb because it's hard, it's difficult, or you think it would be better for the two of you, or your children, or any of those things, think again. I think that's probably like the shortest of short takes that I would give on the context there. Because, like Terry has said, and David and I probably would easily echo the same terms, the general tenor of the New Testament and the Old Testament is stay married. God does not like, he uses hate, divorce. So stay married. And work to have a great marriage is the bonus after that.
Yeah, and I think one of the things to point out too is the reason to stay married, I think in this text often is also kind of found in verse 16. And Edwin points out that this has to be the difference between holiness and salvation, is because there is this presentation by Paul about you can make your mate holy or have made them holy, but you will, how do you not know that you will save them? So there's a future to the salvation extent. And so I think one of the things to point out about the overarching reason to stay married is to glorify God and help in the salvation of your mate. And I think one of the things that we kind of misunderstand about divorce is a general rule, is that regardless of what the circumstances are, it makes life more difficult, and it makes life as a disciple, almost in every case, regardless of reason, more difficult. And I think that's one of the things to consider about that is one of the major reasons to stay married is verse 16, because you doing that might be their salvation. And what greater focus and love for the person you married is there than wanting to save them from whatever it may be that they need saving from. And I just think that's one of the really important points of this chapter there in verse 16.
All right, verses 17 through 24. I think we can move forward a little bit here.
What about verse 15, Phil?
Verse 15. Are you trying to undercut me here?
We tried to avoid that. Let's just...
All right, so the unbelieving partner. Do we really want to get deeper into this? We can. Don't mind it at all.
Well, just to
Right.
not completely observe the Passover, but there is the
Passover.
point being made there in verse 15 that that here you have a situation where maybe the unbeliever is not going to want to be married to a Christian.
Yeah.
Maybe these people were married, and then one of them is converted to Christ, the other one is not, and maybe is antagonistic about that, and as he mentions here, may even depart from the believing mate.
Yeah.
And so you're not a slave to your unbelieving mate. You're a slave of Christ. That's your primary relationship. That's first and foremost. And so you can't leave Christ in order to save your marriage, I think is part of the thrust of what's being said there.
Yeah, I think, and I'll go ahead and be limb standing for a second on verse 15. If Terry stands on the limb, that's his choice. I'm the graceless orangutan of the crew. Here's the thing. I 100% agree that the text here is certainly giving the strength to stay with Jesus. Don't chase after your unfaithful, reprobate husband, spiritually speaking. And this is the area where I think there's room for us to consider that that's not a first century thing or a 21st century thing. It happens all the time. It's not just a cultural first century conflict, because all of us know believers and unbelievers alike who have committed criminal misbehavior, spiritual misbehavior, and run off back into the world and destroyed and harmed their spouses. It doesn't in this text talk about remarital options. It talks about staying with Jesus. And those are texts that are answered elsewhere.
It also doesn't talk about you leaving them for those reasons.
Accurate too.
And so I think it's just one of those things to make sure we keep at least this passage in what it says,
Right.
rather than trying to expound it in some way to say something it's not. And there's a real danger here with that. And let me say this too, that the key to that, I think, is the peace part. Like, you're not enslaved, but you do need to be a peaceable person in this process. There is a requirement of that.
Right.
And I gotta say, I've seen a lot of cases. I'll stand on this limb, which I've never known that you are the more graceless of the two of us. It's usually my moniker. But in a lot of cases, just anecdotally, the things that I've seen people try to use this as the defense, I've not seen the person who's claiming that status as being the one left as being very peaceful in that process. I mean, there's a lot of things here that you need to consider before you hang your hat on this verse.
Yeah. Also, this is not dealing in this context with criminal misbehavior. I set that as an aside because that produces some of the spiritual conflict that takes place. But we can't conflate those two ideas. Criminal behavior has criminal consequences, but it doesn't end the marriage. It ends access and opportunity. It doesn't stand in as a new clause for remarriage. There's other textual areas to answer those questions. Doesn't mean you can't appeal to authority and you can't appeal to the law when you're being harmed. Like, your marriage is not a shield for misbehavior, whether it's spiritual, personal, or criminal. And so I'll make one little quick statement, and if folks want to ask questions about this, both publicly or privately, I don't care. Answer them, ask them, all of that. But to anyone who would use a marital bond as some sort of excuse to say, let's put it this way, you can't call the cops on your spouse, is really inappropriate to absolute sin, depending on the nature of how forceful they make those comments.
But agree.
Yeah. Well, I think kind of maybe the undercurrent of this passage is, especially as we're talking about a believer and an unbeliever, you're the Christian, you're the believer, do not be the problem. You can't control what the other person does, but you're the one who's in Christ. Don't be the problem.
Yeah, and I would add to that, you go back to this verse 16, that the idea of wanting to save your mate, that also means not only don't be the problem, but try to be the solution if at all possible. So
Right.
if there is some kind of behavior that's destroying this relationship, that's not an excuse to hit the eject button and leave. If you have the right kind of perspective to your relationship, and I don't mind talking about this privately, anybody wants to contact me, I will tell you, as I say publicly, I think overarching this idea is stay with your mate, try to work things out, and try to save their soul. I think sometimes we're in a disposable culture, man. We have something that breaks and we go ahead and replace it without even trying to fix it most of the time. And just from that standpoint, we've done that with marriages sometimes. And the overarching principle here is try to work it out, try to pursue the peace, try to save your mate. Be the victim sometimes in order to save your mate. I think all of that comes into play in here and needs to be considered.
Yeah. Technical side note, as the technician and the one-man monkey show that tries to fix all the things, we're trying to get the audio just right. And so we'll see how it goes. Making it happen less and less.
We got a couple of comments to probably add in there while you try to fix the audio, Phil, that I'll go ahead and mention. Hal says here, he's saying with someone who had abandoned his marriage to more fully follow Christ, the flip side of what David was saying, and subtly emphasizing to him that you can serve Jesus in any circumstances, including poor or suboptimal marriages. And I think there's something to that. By the way, I shudder at this statement. I'll just say that publicly, that somebody has abandoned their marriage to follow Christ. And all I'll say about that is I struggle with understanding how abandoning your marriage and the covenant you made is going to make you follow Christ, because part of being a Christ follower is being a covenant keeper. And I don't know all the details, so it's a very general statement that's just made in that way. I don't want to get too far in the weeds. The other one from Edwin really is kind of lengthy, but dives into this idea of the cultural things of if the man became a Christian and the wife didn't, or the wife did, the man didn't, that would normally, in this case, end the marriage. And we shouldn't read our modern problems into this, but we should understand Paul saying, even if your mate doesn't follow you into this new religion, if they'll stay with you, stay with them. And solid point to consider there as well. The issue with the reason why we have to look at some probably more modern applications, at least from my standpoint, is because that's what everybody does. We have to at least acknowledge that a little bit, unfortunately. There you go. There's a buffer. Did you get the things worked out, Phil?
I got some of the things worked out. We'll see if this solution system works here. Kind of trying to fix stuff the best I can. So we'll see. As with all things, we'll see. So a couple of things to add to where we're at in the text. I hope that answers verse 15 as best as we can understand for everybody. And a couple technical side notes. If you're watching on YouTube, you should be able to scrub back in the audio, and the audio kind of gets covered up that way in a healthier way. But there probably will be some skips and glitches as time goes, because I can't control all the internets, only a couple of them at one time.
I think it's happening because you're using an old iPad.
Yeah, well, he might show up again.
Let me say this, though. I think that's a great illustration, Terry, that Phil did not just discard his old iPad just because it became old.
That's true.
Right.
He still recognizes that there's a useful...
He knew one day he would need an old iPad.
Useful properties in that old iPad.
Yeah.
Don't just discard it.
Yeah. He's discarded all of his books, but not his old iPad. Anyway, we need to move forward. Let's get into verse 17 through 24. Phil, do you want me to read that? You want to read that?
Would you go ahead and read that for us, please?
Yeah. Only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. This is my rule in all the churches. Was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision. For neither circumcision counts for anything nor uncircumcision, but keeping the commandments of God. Each one of you should remain in the condition in which he was called. Were you a bondservant when called? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. For he who is called in the Lord as a bondservant is a freedman of the Lord. Bought with a price, do not become bondservants of men. So, brothers, in whatever condition each was called, there let him remain with God.
All right. So, as we continue to kind of straighten some stuff up, make some things work, make some things not work, we'll see how this goes. We are now again back into 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verses. I'm talking myself through stuff as I click buttons. Sorry about that. All right, so this is the second half of the conversation, at least as I see it. There's quite a bit going on there in the text. Everyone still here with me? Terry, David?
I'm here.
All right, good. I'm
Present.
trying to make this smooth. I didn't hear any noise. I was like, oh, what buttons did I push? But some of the things we see here, both in the text and in the broader context of the message, are kind of applicable based on the background. Live as you were called expands the story beyond the marital side and into the larger, here's all the things side. So what are you guys seeing taking place here in 17 through 24?
Well, I'll start off with just this stay as you are kind of thing, remain in that state. And I think the use of the circumcision is just a really good illustration of that in this context, and of the slavery versus the freedman. And I think when I read through that, the idea of if you're a slave, stay that way. Now, if you can gain your freedom, then try to do that. I mean, you can't really read that and not think about Philemon, right? And what Paul writes there in Philemon about wanting to free. But But the reality is, his whole point is, whatever state you're in, serving, and I think the overall thing is, serving Christ does not mean that you have to be out of this relationship or alter something about that. You can serve him as a slave or as a free man. You can serve him whether you're circumcised or uncircumcised. You can serve him whether you're married to a believer or you're married to an unbeliever. And just that awareness that you're able to be a disciple without changing those kind of things on the outside of your commitment to the Lord. And I think that's the really just principle that he's laying down here.
Yeah, I think it's, the first part of the chapter and even later, it's about marriage. We talk about this chapter as being about marriage, but underlying all of that is the relationship with Christ. That's really the underlying relationship that overrules all of these things. And so, like Terry's talking about, what does this relationship with Christ mean, and what does it not mean? Now that we've entered into this relationship with him, how does that affect these other things, these other relationships, these other characteristics of our lives? And so he's addressing that in this section. And it's interesting, in verse 17, we get one of those statements at the end of verse 17 that's evidence of a pattern of teaching that's delivered. Right. This is not just something specific to Corinth, but this is the pattern for all the churches. This is the consistent message of the apostles' teaching here that's being set forth. And as we think about being in the calling, like Terry said, stay the way you are, whatever condition you're in, and especially verse 20, remaining in the calling in which you're called. Of course, we have to qualify that, so that this isn't abused as it sometimes is, where people want to stay as they are in sin.
Right.
It's modified by passages like 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 that talk about how God has called us in holiness, not uncleanness. So the understanding is we're not talking about sinful conditions in relationships here.
And this ties back to earlier on when we kind of introduced this section on marriage and staying married and unbeliever, non-believer, when Paul says, hey, if the unmarried or the widow can stay that way, stay that way. So he's already laid down in the principle for marriage. He's already said that earlier. And now he's coming back after that discussion and just reinforcing that with these other explanations, circumcision, bondage, those kind of things, and saying it's the same with these other things. But the thing to understand is, like David said, none of those things would be an obstacle or a stumbling block or a sin to you serving the Lord, right? So you got to understand that this isn't a come as you are passage. This is somebody who has given their lives to Christ, which includes repentance. This is the idea of remaining in that way that doesn't impact your relationship with God, remaining in the way which you were called, I think is the way to kind of understand that. Phil?
Yeah. By the way, I think I got all the tech stuff. Detect. We'll see. But looking at it in a practical sense, and I think Michael Walls and Edwin have talked, as Simona, Tim, that is. I don't know if Simona's watching or not. I've really kind of honed in on a principle that's really vital for us to recognize. This is not about what's comfortable, easy, or self-serving. This is about selflessness, humility, and what's best for the cause of another person's soul or your own. And if we can shift our focus away from our earthly baggage, if you will, then things become a little bit more understandable. I love that Paul uses the difficult illustration of circumcision to describe this next layer of instruction, because it really was the iconic separation between the Gentile and the Jewish world. It was seen as the significant identifier. And yet, Paul serves as a visual bridge between each of those transformation journeys for a lot of people. He was heavily identified with the circumcised, and yet he was sent to the Gentiles, the uncircumcised. Some of those who were with him were late circumcisers, and as into adulthood, They chose to be circumcised in order to reach folks who would not necessarily listen to them. And so that's superficial level on the outside looking in. And yet for Paul, his transformation was massive. His heart changed in all of that process. So seeing that and having him write to someone who clearly is in significant spiritual turmoil, potential persecution, weird questions. Should we even touch a woman? Should we even touch someone? To say, look, your marriages are actually more important than you think they are, in essence. And whatever marital state that you came into your relationship to Jesus, you don't just drop it because it's no longer convenient or no longer easy or no longer something that you think is wise. Those are not the deciding issues. And I think that's probably, at least in part, why you see him employ an image that in 21st century America, we still struggle with properly categorizing. Freedman, slave. Freedman, bondservant. We've left the cattle ownership model of slavery that was the American heritage, where we abused one another for the gain of others. But first century culture, slavery was like normal. It was normalized, and there was different concepts of slavery in play. So he's using this image that sometimes is really hard for us to process to teach us what we really need to think about. And so before we go any farther in text, especially the unmarried and widowed section, which might be easier, I don't know. And Edwin, we're not getting to your request that we finish chapter 7.
Well, I think it's funny about that, by the way. I just wanted to say this and publicly out Edwin. For somebody who doesn't want to talk about chapter 7, he's talking a whole lot about chapter 7 in the comments.
Well, that's Edwin. I mean, are we surprised? Like, he wants to pick on us? I can certainly apply comedic endeavors to a friend, and I'm sure he's tough enough to take it too.
He is, but he'll also get you back. Watch out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, David, anything that, especially on that last section there, verses 22 to 24 range, that is important for us to see to understand?
Well, it's I think that verse 23, you're bought at a price, do not become slaves of men. Again, recognizing first and foremost the relationship you have with Christ. You're purchased by his blood. That's your number one relationship. That's your number one focus. And so everything else is going to be secondary to that in whatever situation you find yourself.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of, I think, the point he's trying to get across here. And I always think it's interesting there at the end of verse 21, he's not saying that, if you're a slave, don't ever become free. But what he says about that is that if you can be made free, use it. And so there again, we have that thread running through this chapter, right? What can you do to further the cause of Christ? What can you do to save your mate? What can you do to serve God? Can you better serve God if you can put yourself in this particular position? And so there are all those important threads running through here that we want to at least notice as we move along.
I'll make a little soapbox sidebar because I can. For those who teach and lead, my suggestion to you, this is not a mandate, so it's a I say not the Lord thing. Consider in the lessons that you select things that will help people navigate the challenges of building a good marriage when things aren't good, rather than lessons designed to give them the levers to pull to get out of the marriage. I think there's some prudence in balancing those two things. It's not that one's more important than the other, but Paul's kind of saying it is. He's saying, look, learning to stay in the marriage is actually more important than understanding the escape buttons and the get out of the jail free cards that you're looking for, because they don't exist. And so lessons on healthy relationships, lessons on developing holiness in the midst of trial, lessons like this from the text of 1 Corinthians 7 all that stuff I think would be really, really important. Sidebar over. You can jump on the sidebar if you want. It's up to you.
Let me add this to the sidebar with my own little sidebar. What I find interesting is a lot of people go here to chapter 7 to try to make concessions for remarriage, when if you read this in its entire context, what Paul's really saying is, and the slave is a good illustration of this. If you can get freed, free yourself so you have more ability to serve Christ. And what's interesting is people want to use this passage to go, oh, this says I can divorce. And yet Paul's advice would be, hey, if your mate leaves, that's okay. You're not enslaved, but don't go remarry. Because remember, he says to the unmarried, to the widows, stay as you are. His advice would, now you can serve the Lord. And especially when we get to this right lengthy explanation here that we've not gotten into, we'll get into with Evan tomorrow about anxiety. Now you can do more for the Lord. And so what I think is interesting about that is not only preach things that help people stay together, don't take a text like this and preach something that quite frankly doesn't fit the spirit of the context. Because the spirit of the context of chapter 7 is, if you find yourself unmarried for whatever reason, dedicate yourself to serving the Lord and don't seek a mate. That's the overall spirit of the text. So I think that's just a soapbox sidebar of mine is, I think sometimes we read our modern stuff into this and we try to make an application to give an allowance for something that Paul would disagree with in this context from that standpoint.
David, the sidebar is open before we do our round robin, around the horn last comments here. So do you want to stay up in the sidebar, or are you going to create your own?
The sidebar to the sidebar to the sidebar.
Accurate.
No, that's good. I think that, always the admonition to respect the context and not try to read modern things into instruction that was given in ancient times is always the right way to look at it, instead of flipping that around. That's key at all times.
All right. So around the horn, Terry, what you got? Last comments, special notes, anything important for us to think about before we see each other again in 23 hours?
Well, as we've already said, Edmund will be with us tomorrow. And one thing that I was already thinking, Walls points out, this bought with a price is a theme in this letter. And we saw that in chapter 6, right? And it's interesting to just compare those two applications. Chapter 6 was talking about sexual promiscuity, and don't do that because you're bought with a price, and glorify God in your body. And here we have this idea of, that starts off with kind of that same subject, but within the marital bonds. And hey, remain in whatever condition you are. You are bought with a price. Remember, you were bought with a price. You don't own yourself. Nobody owns you. You belong to the Lord. And I think, and David said that over and over again, this is really about serving Jesus. And Walls just said, your marriage is not about you. That's correct. It's not about you. And to a degree, it's not even about your mate. I mean, it is, but all that secondary to your marriage is really about the Lord. I think that's one of the things that this text really points to as well. And places like Ephesians 5 that really reflect your marriage is a reflection of your understanding of the Lord, your relationship with the Lord. Just remember that you were bought with a price. Reflect that in your marriage and in your home.
Mr. David Dan.
Well,
Mr.
I mean,
Edward Dan.
That's the I'll just piggyback on that. That's the overall point. I think if we could ever get it in our minds and keep it there, that we belong to the Lord, that has an impact on everything that he talks about here in our relationships and in our circumstances in life, our work relationships. If we want to apply that to the slavery and freedmen discussion, definitely the marriage relationship. If we could just keep that in front of us, that we belong to the Lord. And so he owns us. Whatever we do has to be approved by the owner. We have to do things his way, no matter what. If we could just keep that in our minds, then a lot of these problems would be lessened in impact.
Yeah. I'll echo a couple of things and add one more thing to think about. 1 Corinthians as a letter is sometimes chopped up into pieces. We think, well, it's a chapter 5 thing, a chapter 7 thing, a chapter 10 thing. We do that with all the New Testament. When nobody really writes correspondence that way. We don't write letters that way. We don't write conversation that way. We write legal documents that way. But then those are really hard to understand.